The 25th of November 2009. A statement goes out from a company office in Dubai. It is short, most of it is procedural. Buried inside it is a request. The company would like 6 more months before it pays anybody. The number attached to that request is $26 billion. The company is called Dubai World. It is owned by the government. It owns ports on 4 continents. It owns a chain of artificial islands built out into the Gulf in the shape of a palm tree. It owns land, hotels, shipping terminals, and a property developer called Nakheel. Nakheel has a bond coming due, $4.1 billion. It matures on the 14th of December. That is 19 days away. The statement does not say the money is not there. It does not have to. Everyone reading it understands what a request for a standstill means. Then the government of Dubai adds one sentence of its own. It says it does not guarantee the debts of Dubai World. The reaction is measured in hours. Nakheel's bond loses more than half its value in 3 days. Dubai's stock index takes its worst fall in over a year. In London and New York, traders who could not have found the emirate on a map 2 days earlier begin pricing the odds that a Gulf city defaults before Christmas. And 11 kilometers inland, a tower stands finished. It is the tallest structure ever built by human beings. Half a mile of steel and glass in the desert. The opening ceremony is already scheduled. The invitations are already printed. The name on those invitations is not the name it will end up with, because Dubai is about to be rescued. And the price of a rescue is not always money. 2 years earlier, this city was the fastest growing address on Earth. Cranes outnumbered churches, mosques, and schools combined. Property was sold, resold, and sold again before a foundation was poured. And now the whole thing is 19 days from stopping. But here is the part that gets missed. This was not the first time. It was the third. This city had already been made rich twice by 2 different substances in 2 different centuries. And it had already lost one of those fortunes completely, not slowly, not partially, completely. This is Dubai. Almost everyone who has heard of it believes they know where the money came from. Oil, a hole in the sand, a well, a pipeline, and a city that grew out of it the way cities grow out of luck. That story is wrong in almost every detail. Oil was found here in 1966. It was found offshore, 60 miles out, and there was never very much of it. 4 billion barrels against a neighbor holding 96% of the country's reserves. Production peaked in 1991 and has been falling since. Today, oil is worth less than 1% of this economy. In the early 1980s, it was worth about half. So this is not a story about striking oil. It is a story about a place that struck oil, understood exactly how little it had, and spent almost all of it inside 20 years, deliberately, buying things that could not run dry. Ports, runways, a free zone, an airline. And before any of that, there was another fortune entirely. Older, stranger, and gone so thoroughly that most people who live here now have never seen the thing it was built on. So, how does a place with no resource worth having get rich twice? And why was the fortune that nearly killed it the only one it did not actually own? It starts with a creek. Dubai Creek is not a river. Nothing feeds it. It is a saltwater inlet that reaches about 14 kilometers inland from the Gulf, bending twice, shallow enough in places that a man could walk it. For most of recorded history, that was the entire advantage. There was no farmland here worth the name, no mineral deposit, no mountain pass, no river valley, no strategic strait. What there was a sheltered notch in an otherwise hostile coastline where a wooden boat could sit out a storm. And beneath the water offshore, there were oyster beds. The pearl banks of the Arabian Gulf were worked for something close to 4,000 years. Not seasonally at first, occasionally, opportunistically, by whoever was on that stretch of coast. By the 19th century, it had become the organizing fact of life, every settlement between Kuwait and Oman. Pearls were the largest trade sector in the region. Not one of the largest, the largest. And the way that trade worked is the reason everything after it happened the way it did. A pearling voyage needed a boat, a crew, food and water for 4 months, and money up front. Almost nobody had money up front, so the season was financed. A merchant advanced the funds. A captain, the nakuda, took the boat out with 30 or 40 men aboard. The divers went down on a rope with a stone tied to their foot, waited to sink fast. No air. A clip of turtle shell on the nose, wax in the ears. They worked the beds in dives of about a minute, 100 times a day, from first light until they could not do it again. And they were paid out of what was left. The advance came first. The financier's share came first. The captain's share came first. What remained was divided among the crew, and if the season was poor, the difference did not vanish. It carried. It became debt. Debt that followed a man to the next season. Debt that, in many cases, followed him to his son. The men who went into the water owned nothing. The men who never left the shore owned the water. That is the shape of the first fortune. Remember it. This coast is going to build the same shape again, twice more, with different men at the bottom of it. Meanwhile, the pearls themselves went nowhere near the people who wore them. A pearl bought from a diver's captain on the Dubai wharf was sold to a tawash, a specialist buyer who could grade it by eye. From there, it moved to Bombay, which, by the end of the 19th century, was the largest pearl market on Earth. Bombay drilled it, polished it, and sold it on to Paris, London, Istanbul, and New York. So, a gem prized out of the Gulf seabed by a man in debt was worn at a dinner in Mayfair, and almost none of that price ever came back down the chain. The margin lived in the middle. And Dubai, quietly, was building itself into the middle. Because Dubai did something its neighbours did not. In 1901, it dropped its customs duties. Traders who were being taxed across the water in Persia began moving their operations across to the creek. Merchants from Bandar Lenga arrived and stayed, and their descendants built the coral and gypsum wind tower houses that still stand in Bustakia. It was not a large decision. It was the decision. Dubai could not outproduce anyone. It could not outfarm anyone. What it could do was cost less to pass through than the alternatives. Nothing about that has changed in 124 years. By the eve of the First World War, the Gulf pearl economy was at its height. Hundreds of boats went out of this creek each season. The town lived on a 4-month window and spent the other 8 preparing for it. And then a laboratory in Japan solved a problem that had been unsolvable since antiquity. A natural pearl is an accident. An irritant enters an oyster, the oyster coats it, and if it happens to coat it evenly, in the right nacre, over enough years, the result is worth a fortune. The odds are terrible. That is precisely what the price was made of. Not beauty. Scarcity. Kokichi Mikimoto had been working on the problem since the 1890s. By the 1920s, the technique was industrial. A nucleus inserted by hand. An oyster farmed, not hunted. A pearl that was chemically identical, visually identical, and produced on purpose. The price of scarcity collapsed because scarcity had been manufactured out of existence. Then, in 1929, the second blow. The luxury markets of Europe and America stopped buying anything at all. By the early 1930s, the Gulf pearl trade was finished. Not diminished, finished. Here, that period has a name: the Years of Hunger. The financiers who had funded the fleets went under, and when they went under, the credit that ran the entire coast disappeared with them. Boats were beached. Whole coastal villages emptied as families moved inland to herd goats and grow dates, or left for Bahrain, for Persia, for anywhere with a wage. The divers' debts did not disappear. There was simply no longer any season in which to work them off. For a town whose entire economy was one commodity, sold to one distant market, at a price set by a scarcity somebody else had learned to fake, there was no second industry to fall back into. And this is the lesson Dubai learned first, before it learned anything else. Not that fortunes end, that a fortune resting on a single substance ends without warning and takes everything with it. Sheikh Saeed bin Maktoum Al Maktoum ruled here through all of it. He had almost no revenue and no reserves. What he had was one asset that the crash could not touch: a port that cost less to use than any other port on the coast. He kept it that way. Through the crash, through the hunger, through the war years that followed, when even the transit trade thinned to almost nothing. There was, at that point, no reason on paper for this settlement to exist at all. What saved it was a metal it did not mine, could not refine, and had no use for. In 1947, India became independent, and almost immediately restricted the private import of gold. The reasoning was currency control. The effect was a wall between the world's most enthusiastic gold-buying population and the world's gold. Indian households did not stop wanting gold. Gold is not decoration there. It is a savings account you can wear, passed down, cashed in at a wedding or a funeral or a bad year. Demand did not fall. It went looking for a door. The door was here. Dubai had no import duty worth mentioning. It had a creek full of wooden dhows with crews who had been sailing to the Indian coast for 200 years. And it had, sitting in the town, branches of British banks willing to finance the trade. So gold began arriving by air. From London bullion houses, from Switzerland. Flown into Dubai, legally, declared, warehoused. Then it went out again by sea. A dhow would load 10 tola bars, small, uniform, easy to carry, and sail east for the Indian coast. It stopped 3 miles off. That was the limit of Indian territorial waters. There, in international water, the cargo changed hands. Indian boats took it the rest of the way. By Dubai's law, nothing improper had occurred. The gold was imported legally and exported legally to a buyer who took delivery at sea. What that buyer did afterwards was, as the merchants here pointed out with some care, not a Dubai matter. The scale is what makes it a fortune rather than an anecdote. In 1966, 4 million ounces of gold were shipped from London to Dubai. Only France and Switzerland took more. In 1968, gold imports here were worth £56 million, into a town of a few tens of thousands of people, with more bank branches than paved roads. Alongside it came $15 million of wristwatches and 5 million ounces of silver. And the arithmetic underneath it was very simple. Gold in 1967 was $35 an ounce in London. In India, it fetched around $68. $33 an ounce for moving a metal across 3 miles of water. By some estimates, 3/4 of all the gold entering India was passing through this creek. But few people know what that money was actually being used for, because it was not being hoarded. It was being spent on the one problem that had limited this town since the day it was founded. The creek was silting up. It always had. By the 1950s, the channel was so shallow that the larger vessels of the era could not enter at all. Cargo had to be lighted in by small boat, which cost time, which cost money, which sent ships to other ports. The town's single asset was closing. In 1954, a study was commissioned to find out what it would cost to dredge it. The answer was more money than Dubai had, so it was borrowed. £200,000 raised from a bank in Dubai. 400,000 more loaned from Kuwait. Understand what that meant at the time. There was no oil here. There was no revenue stream to pledge. A settlement of a few tens of thousands of people took on foreign debt to deepen a ditch, on the theory that ships would come. Sheikh Rashid bin Saeed Al Maktoum, who became ruler in 1958, spent the rest of his life making versions of that same bet. Dredging began in 1959. By 1961, the channel could take vessels of 5,000 tons. Traffic did not increase gradually, it moved in. The gamble worked so completely that the pattern hardened into a policy. Borrow against the future you have decided to have. Build the thing before the demand for it exists. Let the demand arrive afterwards. Hold that thought. It reappears in this story twice more. Once at a scale that transforms the city, and once at a scale that nearly ends it. By 1962, Rashid needed a bridge across the creek, and did not have the money for that either. He borrowed it from his brother-in-law, the ruler of Qatar, and repaid it with a toll. He cut customs duties further. He put merchants, including foreign merchants, into senior positions in his own administration. There was an office at the wharf with a mirrored window, from which a man Rashid employed watched cargo coming off the ships, so that the manifests presented the following morning could be checked against what had actually been unloaded. This is not a romantic story about vision. It is a story about a man running a port as a business, in a place where the port was the only business. And then, in 1966, the thing every ruler in the Gulf had been waiting for finally happened here. Oil. Except that the way it happened is the reason the world has misunderstood this city ever since. Abu Dhabi had struck oil in 1958, onshore and in enormous quantity. Dubai spent the next 8 years drilling and finding nothing. When it finally hit, in 1966, the field was called Fateh. It was 60 miles offshore, not near the coast, not visible from it. 60 miles out into the Gulf, in open water, roughly halfway to Iran. There was nowhere to put the crude. building a tank farm on shore and a pipeline back across 60 miles of seabed made no sense for a field this size. So the operator built the storage underneath the sea instead. Vast, submerged tanks, the kazans, sunk on the seabed beside the platforms. One was announced in 1968 as holding 500,000 barrels. Crude came up, went into a tank on the seafloor, and was loaded straight onto tankers in open water. The first export left in 1969, 180,000 barrels. And this is the detail that dismantles the myth completely. If you had stood on the beach at Dubai in 1971, at the height of the oil era, you would not have seen a single piece of oil infrastructure. No derricks, no flare stacks, no refinery, no tank farm. The oil industry of Dubai was, physically, over the horizon and under the water. The world looked at the skyline that came afterwards and assumed the two things were one story. They were never one story. There was never enough oil here for that. 4 billion barrels in total, against a neighbor holding 96% of the country's reserves. Production peaked in 1991 at 410,000 barrels a day and has fallen ever since. At that peak, Saudi Arabia was producing more than 20 times as much. And the gas position was worse than the oil position. A city in the Gulf runs on gas, not for heating, for electricity, and for the desalination plants that turn seawater into the only drinking water this place has. Power and water here are the same industrial process, and that process burns gas continuously. Dubai holds around 2% of the country's gas. So in 2000, it signed up to buy its gas from Qatar, piped several hundred kilometers across the seabed of the Gulf. Read that back slowly. The city the world calls an oil state imports the fuel that keeps its lights on and its taps running. Which tells you something about how thin the resource story here always was, and how early the people running it knew. Rashid seems to have understood the size of what he had almost immediately, and he treated it as a fund with an expiry date rather than an income. The money went into hardware, roads, power generation, desalination, because a city cannot grow past a certain size on groundwater in a place with no rivers. A runway long enough for long-haul aircraft. And berths. Always more berths. Port Rashid opened in 1972, on the seaward side of the creek mouth, and it was the moment Dubai stopped being a creek town. Deep water quays, container cranes, ships that never needed to enter the creek at all. The old creek trade did not die. Dhows still load there today, stacked to the rail with air conditioners.
And tyres and refrigerators bound for Iran and East Africa. But the money moved out to the coast. Port Rashid was expanded almost as soon as it opened, from 15 berths to 35, because it filled faster than anyone had planned for. Which raised an obvious question. If a port built for the traffic of 1972 was full before the decade ended, what should you build for the traffic of the year 2000? The answer became the largest infrastructure decision in the history of the Gulf. At the time, it was widely regarded as a mistake. 35 kilometres down the coast from the creek, there was nothing. Salt flat, low dunes, a stretch of shallow water with no settlement on it worth the name. In 1976, Dubai began digging a harbour there. Not extending one, digging one. Excavating a basin out of the desert and letting the Gulf in behind it. Jebel Ali opened in February 1979. Around 15 berths at first, sized for the largest ships then afloat. It was the largest man-made harbour in the world, large enough to be picked out from orbit. And for its first years, it was close to empty. The traffic did not exist. Dubai already had Port Rashid, which handled what the region actually shipped. Jebel Ali had been built for cargo volumes that no one could yet demonstrate. It was called a folly, a monument, a hole in the ground that would swallow the Emirates' remaining oil revenue and give nothing back. What the critics were measuring was demand. What Rashid had built was capacity. Those are not the same thing, and the difference between them is the entire commercial theory of this city. A port that is full turns ships away. A port that is half empty takes anything, immediately, at short notice, with no queue. For a shipping line, that is not spare concrete. That is reliability. And reliability is what a line will reroute an entire service for. Then, in 1985, Dubai added the second half of the idea. It drew a boundary around the land behind the quays and declared that inside that line, a foreign company could own itself outright. No local partner, no corporate tax, no personal income tax, no duty on anything imported, stored, processed or shipped back out. No restriction on taking the profits home. The Jebel Ali Free Zone opened with 19 companies in it. Understand what that combination actually does. Before, a manufacturer in Germany selling into the Gulf, East Africa and South Asia shipped from Hamburg to each market separately. Separate paperwork, separate duty, separate delay. Now it could ship one consolidated load to Jebel Ali, hold it duty-free beside the berths, break it down as orders came in, and deliver into 30 markets from a single warehouse. The port stopped being a destination. It became a hinge. That free zone now holds more than 11,000 companies from over 100 countries. In one recent year, it moved $190 billion of trade. The port beside it handled 15.5 million containers. The empty harbour is now the busiest in the Middle East. Rashid did not live to see most of it. He suffered a stroke in 1981 and died in 1990, in the gap between the bet and the payoff, which is where the people who make these decisions usually end up. And that same year, 1985, Dubai made another bet with the same logic and a much smaller budget. Gulf Air, the regional carrier, had cut back its flights into Dubai. For a city whose entire proposition was ease of access, that was not an inconvenience. It was an attack on the product. So a former British Airways executive named Maurice Flanagan was given an instruction. Build an airline. You have 5 months. You have $10 million. There will be no subsidy afterwards and no protected routes. The sky over Dubai stays open to your competitors. $10 million does not buy an aircraft. It did not buy one then either. 2 planes were wet leased from Pakistan International Airlines, a Boeing 737 and an Airbus A300, repainted and flown with borrowed crews. On the 25th of October 1985, the first flight left Dubai for Karachi with 103 people aboard. The second route was Bombay, not London, not Frankfurt. The Indian subcontinent, because that is where the labour, the trade and the family traffic already were, and because those routes could be made to pay from the first month. The first full year of operation carried 287,000 passengers and earned $63 million. Emirates is now one of the largest international airlines on Earth, and the airport it flies out of is one of the busiest in the world by international traffic. Transport and storage, the port, the airport, the airline, the warehouses behind them,
is worth around 12 to 13% of everything this economy produces. All of it bought with oil money, by people who had already been told once what happens when a single commodity runs out. But there was a third piece, and it is the one that changes what Dubai was selling. It is 1979. The port at Jebel Ali has just opened, and on the empty road out of the city, in open sand, Dubai finishes a 39-story office tower. There is nothing around it, nothing for kilometers. The nearest buildings are low, and behind it there is desert. The World Trade Center is the tallest building in the Middle East, and it is standing in a place with no demand for a single floor of it. The reaction is what you would expect. Vanity. A monument with a lift shaft. It filled. Then the land around it filled. Then the road between it and the creek filled. And that road is now Sheikh Zayed Road, a corridor of towers 8 lanes wide with the tallest skyline in the region on either side of it. And somewhere in that decade, the thing Dubai was selling quietly changed. It had always sold transit, cheap passage for someone else's cargo. Now it began to sell an address, a place where a foreign company could put its regional headquarters, keep its profits, and reach 30 markets before lunch. You can still see both economies running side by side today. At Al Quoz, warehouses and workshops in unbroken rows, servicing everything the skyline needs and appearing in none of the photographs. At Dragon Mart, a building over a kilometer long, laid out in the shape of a dragon, containing nothing but Chinese wholesale goods moving into the Gulf and Africa. In Bur Dubai, the textile souk, where bolts of cloth are still sold by weight in shops narrower than a corridor. At the Dera fish market before dawn, where the trade that existed before the pearls, before the gold, and before the oil is still going on, unchanged in every particular except the ice. And inland at Hatta, in the Hajar Mountains, an old exclave of stone foliage channels and terraced farms, the version of this place that never got a port. By the end of the 1990s, Dubai had done something almost no resource economy has ever done. It had converted a small, brief oil windfall into a set of permanent, income-producing assets before the resource ran out. Oil was already down to a fraction of what it had been in the early 1980s, and it barely mattered. The city was solvent. It was diversified. It had ports, an airline, an airport, free zones, and a growing services sector. And then it found a fourth thing to sell, something it had never sold before: itself. In May 2002, Dubai issued a decree allowing foreign nationals to buy property outright in designated areas of the emirate. Not a lease, not a right of use for 99 years, freehold, with the title, and later with a residence visa attached to it. Nowhere else in the region did that. And the effect was instant, because a very large amount of money had been waiting for exactly this. Money from across the Gulf, from South Asia, from Russia and the former Soviet states, from Europe and, in time, from everywhere. There was no property tax, no income tax, no capital gains tax. Between 2003 and 2008, average property prices in Dubai rose by something on the order of 300% to 400%. But the price rise is not the interesting part. The mechanism underneath it is. Most of what was sold in those years did not exist yet. You bought off-plan. You paid a deposit against a floor in a building that was a rendering and a hoarding on a fenced plot. Construction would take 3 or 4 years. Your obligation was a payment schedule. And, crucially, you could sell that contract on before completion. So people did, often within weeks, sometimes within days. The same unfinished apartment could be sold 3 times before anyone poured its concrete. Each sale was booked at a higher price. Each higher price justified the next launch, at the next site, at a higher price again. Buyers queued from before dawn outside sales offices. People who arrived third in line found nothing left by the time the doors opened. Now compare that to the 2 fortunes that came before it. The pearl was a physical object, prized from a real seabed, sold to a real buyer. The gold was a real metal, weighed, flown in, carried out. The off-plan unit was a promise. Its value did not come from what it was. It came from the certainty that somebody else would pay more for it next quarter. That is a fortune with no flaw under it. It is also the first fortune in this city's history that Dubai did not own outright, because the capital funding it was borrowed, and it was borrowed from abroad. The state-owned companies leading the build-out borrowed too, and enormously. Nakheel built the Palm Jumeirah out into the Gulf. 120 million cubic meters of sand, dredged off the seabed and sprayed into position, ringed by 7 million tons of rock hauled from quarries inland and placed by satellite positioning to within centimeters. And the reason for that shape is pure arithmetic. Dubai's natural coastline runs to about 70 kilometers. Beachfront was the one thing in the emirate that could not be manufactured, zoned, or imported. And beachfront was what commanded the price. So they manufactured it anyway. A trunk, 16 fronds, and a breakwater, laid out to turn a few kilometers of ordinary shore into many times that length of waterfront, every meter of it sellable. The first phase sold out in days. Inland, Emaar was doing the same thing with a different scarcity. Mohammed Al-Abar had founded the company in 1997, and his instrument was not sand. It was proximity. Emaar bought and developed whole districts at once. Not a tower, but the streets, the retail, the lake, and the address around it, so that the value it created in the neighborhood accrued to the land it still owned in the neighborhood. The centerpiece of that was a single project called Downtown Dubai, and at its heart, the tallest tower ever attempted. A tower like that is not, in engineering terms, an efficient building. Past a certain height, floor space is consumed by lifts, structure, and the systems needed to move water and air up the shaft. The upper floors cost far more per square meter than they can ever return, which is precisely why it works. The tower does not have to pay for itself. It has to make every plot in a 2-kilometer radius worth more, and those plots belong to the company building it. By the end of it, Dubai and its state-linked companies had borrowed around $80 billion. But there was a second decree in this period that almost nobody outside finance has ever heard of, and it may have been worth more than the property boom. In 2004, Dubai drew a boundary around 110 acres of ground beside Sheikh Zayed Road and did to law what Jebel Ali had done to customs. Inside that line, the commercial law of the United Arab Emirates does not apply. The Dubai International Financial Center operates its own civil and commercial code, based on English common law, with its own independent courts and its own judges, many of them recruited from the senior benches of Britain, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Proceedings are in English. Judgments are enforceable. And that is the entire product. A bank deciding where to put a regional headquarters is not primarily buying office space or sunshine. It is buying the answer to one question. If a contract worth $400 million goes wrong, whose court hears it? In what language? Under which precedent? And can the result be collected? For decades, the answer across most of the region was uncomfortable enough that the money simply stayed in London. Dubai's response was to import the courtroom. Financial and insurance activity is now worth around 12% of this economy, roughly the same share as every port,
Airport, warehouse and aircraft in the Emirate combined. A jurisdiction, sold like warehouse space. It is the same trade the town has been running since 1901. Charge less to pass through than the alternatives. Only the thing passing through is no longer cloth or gold or containers. It is capital. And then there is the part of this economy that the rest of the world actually sees. A desert city on the Arabian Gulf with summer temperatures above 50 degrees, no lakes, no forest, no ski season, and no antiquity, became one of the most visited cities on the planet. That did not happen because of the beaches. It happened because of the airline. An airline running a hub model needs its passengers to change planes there, and a passenger changing planes has a layover. Dubai took that layover and turned it into a product. Free transit visas. An airport built as a shopping centre with runways attached. Hotels priced across every tier from labour camp budget to the top of the world market. Then it gave people reasons to stay a week instead of an afternoon. Malls with ski slopes and aquariums inside them. A beach season that runs precisely when Northern Europe is at its coldest and darkest. Hotels and restaurants show up as a little over 3% of measured output, which understates it enormously, because a visitor's money lands in retail, in transport, in property, in aviation, and is counted there. A city selling the one commodity it had never had to dig up, ship, or borrow against: attention. The city itself was being built by people almost none of the buyers ever saw. Construction crews came overwhelmingly from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. They arrived owing money to a recruitment agent at home. They were housed in labour camps out past the industrial edge of the city, bussed in before dawn, bussed back after dark. Wages were paid monthly, into an account, by an employer who held the visa, which meant that the workers' ability to stay in the country, to be paid, and to leave were all held by the same party. 80 years earlier, on this same coastline, a diver went into the water against an advance he could not clear, in a season financed by a man who never left the shore. The technology changed completely. The financial position of the man at the bottom of it did not change at all. And when the money stopped in 2008, it was that man who found out first. The trigger was not in Dubai. It was in the credit markets of New York and London, and it arrived in September 2008. Global lending stopped. Not slowed, stopped. Banks that had been rolling short-term funding over as a matter of routine found that there was nothing to roll it into. And Dubai's model had one dependency that no amount of engineering could design around. It needed capital to keep arriving. The buyers had bought off-plan on payment schedules, and many of them had borrowed to do it. When their own markets collapsed, they stopped paying the installments. The developers were funding construction out of those installments, so construction stopped. When construction stops, the contractor is not paid. When the contractor is not paid, the crews are not paid. And a worker whose employer has folded
does not simply lose a job. He loses the visa attached to it, usually within a month. Through the winter of 2008 and into 2009, men were laid off, rounded up in hundreds, and driven to the airport. And this is where the structure of the city's population stops being a statistic and becomes a mechanism. Roughly 9 in 10 people living in Dubai are foreign nationals. Almost none of them hold permanent status. Residency is attached to employment, and employment is attached to a company. Which means that a downturn here does not produce unemployment in the way a downturn elsewhere does. It produces departure. There is no queue at a labour office because there is no labour office to queue at. A city that loses jobs loses people, physically, within weeks. And when the people go, so does the demand for the apartments they rented, the schools they paid for, the shops they used, and the flights they booked. The population is the demand. Detach one, and you lose the other on the same day. Above them, the professional expatriate class was leaving too, and for a related reason. In the UAE, a bounced cheque or an unpayable loan could put you in prison. So people drove to Dubai International, parked, and walked into the terminal without looking back. The cars stayed. Sedans and four-wheel drives in the departure car parks of all 3 terminals, some with real estate company stickers still in the rear windows, accumulating parking fines nobody would ever collect, tyres slowly going flat. That was the image that went around the world. It was also the most accurate summary of what had happened. The people had gone, and the assets they left behind had no buyer. Property prices fell about 40% in the first 3 months of 2009 alone, faster than anywhere else on Earth in that quarter. From the peak, the fall was close to half. Rents dropped by roughly the same. Around 450 projects across the Emirate stopped where they stood, and across the wider region, more than half of a construction pipeline worth hundreds of billions of dollars was put on hold. Half-built cores stood along the water at Business Bay, with cranes still on them and nobody in the cabs. Whole streets in Dubai Marina, sold out on paper, held nothing but concrete frames. A building that is 90% finished and abandoned is worth less than the land it stands on, because someone still has to pay to take it down. By February 2009, the cost of insuring Dubai's debt against default had risen to a level normally associated with countries that had already failed. Abu Dhabi and the central bank had already stepped in twice by then. A $10 billion bond in February, $5 billion more in November, taken up by 2 Abu Dhabi banks. And still, the largest obligation was coming. Which brings us back to where this began. The 25th of November, 2009. Dubai World asks its creditors for a standstill until at least the 30th of May. $26 billion of debt is under discussion. Nakhil's $4.1 billion bond matures on the 14th of December, and the government of Dubai states that it does not guarantee it. The reaction is immediate, and it is global. Nakhil's bond falls as much as 62% in 3 days. Dubai's index has its worst sell-off in over a year. Emerging market bond yields jump. European markets have their worst day in months. Bank shares fall in London on exposures nobody had bothered to look at closely. For 19 days, nobody knows whether Dubai is going to pay. And this is the point at which the difference between the 3 fortunes stops being an abstraction. When the pearl trade collapsed, the loss was total, but nobody outside the Gulf noticed.
It was a local catastrophe in a place with no leverage. The gold trade and the oil, whatever else they were owned. The metal was in the vault. The crude was in the tank. This time, the asset was a promise about a future price, and the money behind it belonged to somebody else, which meant the exposure was not local at all. It reached into banks in Britain, in Europe, across the Gulf, and into the credit rating of every other state-owned company in the Emirate. The 14th of December, 2009, the morning the bond falls due. A statement comes out of the Dubai Financial Support Fund. The government of Abu Dhabi and the Central Bank of the United Arab Emirates have provided $10 billion. 4.1 billion of it is released that day to pay the Nakheel bond in full. Markets reverse within hours. Dubai's index rises 10%, its largest single-day gain in more than a year. Abu Dhabi's rises 7%. The cost of insuring Dubai's debt falls further and faster than at any point since the crisis began. The same afternoon, a decree is issued in Dubai. Decree 57. It creates, essentially from nothing, a legal framework and a tribunal under which Dubai World can be restructured and, if the restructuring fails, be wound up. That is a government writing an insolvency regime for a company it owns on the day that company would otherwise have defaulted. The rest of the money comes with conditions. It covers interest and working capital only into the following April, and only if Nakheel negotiates a standstill on everything else. It is not a gift. It is a bridge, and the terms are written down. Three weeks later, on the 4th of January 2010, the tower opens. 828 metres, more than 160 floors, the tallest structure ever built by human beings, by a margin so large that the previous record looked provincial. It had been under construction for 6 years. Every drawing, every contract, every press release, every hoarding on the site had carried the same name: Burj Dubai, the Dubai Tower. At the opening ceremony, it was announced under a different one, Burj Khalifa, named for Sheikh Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the ruler of Abu Dhabi, whose emirate had put up the $10 billion 21 days earlier. The tallest building in the world, in the centre of Dubai, carries the name of the neighbour that paid to keep the lights on. There is no more precise summary of what happened here than that. Because the pearl fortune ended when the price of scarcity was destroyed. The oil fortune was small and was deliberately spent before it could end. But the third fortune did not end. It was caught. And the cost of being caught was written in letters 6 feet high onto the most photographed object the city had ever built. What followed was slower and got a fraction of the coverage. Dubai World signed a restructuring in 2011 covering around $25 billion of debt, stretching repayment out over years against asset sales that could only happen once values recovered. Nakheel was separated out and restructured on its own terms. Some projects were cancelled outright. Others were finished a decade late. And underneath the restructuring, the rules were rewritten. The single mechanism that had made the boom self-igniting was the developer's ability to spend a buyer's installments on whatever it needed to spend them on, including the next project and the marketing for the project after that. Money for a tower in one district was quietly funding a launch in another. Payments for off-plan property now go into an escrow account tied to that specific project.
The developer cannot draw on it freely. Funds are released against verified construction progress, audited stage by stage. If the project is cancelled, the escrow refunds the buyers. A tribunal was established with the power to liquidate cancelled developments and determine, project by project, who was owed what. It does not stop a market from falling. Nothing does. What it stops is the specific failure that turned a price correction into a systemic one. A chain in which every unfinished building was collateral for the next unfinished building. And the machinery that had been bought with the oil money, the port, the free zone, the airline, the airport, went on working through all of it, because none of it depended on the property market. Trade kept moving. Aircraft kept flying. The revenue that serviced the debt came from the boring assets, not the famous ones. In 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic, Dubai World made its final payment to creditors. $8.2 billion, 2 years ahead of schedule. It had repaid close to $19 billion since 2011. The emirate that spent 19 days in December 2009 unable to say whether it could pay a $4 billion bond had cleared the whole obligation early, in the worst year for global travel in living memory. So what is actually here now? A city of around 4.6 million people on an economy worth roughly $255 billion a year. Wholesale and retail trade is the largest single piece of it, somewhere near a quarter of everything produced. Transport and storage is around 12 to 13%. Finance and insurance, roughly the same. Real estate is about 8. Construction, under 7. Hotels and restaurants, a little over 3. And oil, the thing the whole world still believes built this place, is under 1%. Below the level of a rounding error in the economy it is supposed to explain. The pearl banks are still out there, under the shipping lanes and the oil fields. Nobody dives them. The gold, though, never actually stopped. India lifted its restrictions in the 1990s, and the $33 spread that had built this city's second fortune closed with them. The dhows carrying 10 tola bars to a line 3 miles off the Indian coast had nothing left to earn. So the trade changed shape rather than ending. Dubai kept the thing the smuggling years had actually built: the vaults, the refineries, the assayers, the freight handlers, the banks that would finance a shipment of bullion at short notice, and a customs regime that did not tax it. Today, it is one of the largest physical gold markets on Earth, moving metal legally between Africa, Europe and Asia in quantities measured in hundreds of tons a year. The souk in Dera still trades, on margins a fraction of what they were. Window after window of chains and bangles priced by weight, under the same arithmetic that has run every fortune this city has ever had. Buy where it is cheap, sell where it is dear. Charge as little as possible for the passage in between. The creek still runs 14 kilometers inland, dredged and redredged, with dhows tied 3 deep along the wharf loading refrigerators for East Africa. The largest man-made harbour in the world sits 35 kilometers down the coast, where there was salt flat and nothing, and it handles more containers than any other port in the Middle East. And in the centre of it all stands the tallest building on Earth, carrying somebody else's name. There is a temptation to end this by saying the city learned its lesson. It is not clear that it did, or that lesson is even the right frame. Because the model has not changed. Dubai still builds capacity before the demand exists.
It still borrows to do it. A new airport is being built out at Dubai's south on the same logic that built Jebel Ali in an empty bay in 1976. Capacity first, traffic afterwards. Property is once again the sector that draws the money in from abroad, and once again the buyers are largely foreign. And once again, a great deal of what is sold has not been built yet. Dubai and its state-linked companies owe creditors somewhere in the region of $111 billion. Government debt alone is close to $31 billion and falling. A large share of the wider total comes due before the end of the decade. None of that is a prediction. It is simply the arithmetic of a place that has always chosen to be early rather than safe, and has been proven right more often than it has been proven wrong. Twice, this coastline built a fortune out of something it could hold in its hand. A pearl, a bar of gold. Once, it built one out of something it could not. A flaw in a building that did not exist yet, bought with money that was not its own. The first fortune ended and took the town with it. The second was spent on purpose and became a port, a runway, and an airline. The third had to be rescued by a neighbor and left its name on the skyline. What nobody can tell you is which of those three this city is living in now. Thanks for watching. Until the next